ChatGPT has been all over the news for its ability to interact with humans. It has even been used to pass university exams. But how good is ChatGPT at Chinese? Can it pass the HSK? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. Unless you've been living under a rock for the previous few months, you should at least have heard about ChatGPT, even though I think there are many of you who might not have tried it out for yourself yet. ChatGPT is a chatbot developed by OpenAI and it was launched in late 2022. It has been all over the press as the fastest growing web platform of all time, and there are many reports of it being able to do lots of amazing things, such as pass take-home exam at universities and other things. And that of course made me wonder, can ChatGPT pass the HSK? Before I try to answer that question, I'd like to say that my pronunciation course opens for registration on February the 20th, and if you're interested you can head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or simply check the link in the description. Of course, if you listen to this later, you can still head over there and see if the course is open when you're listening, and if it isn't, you'll be able to sign up to the waiting list. I will talk a little bit more about the course in next week's episode, so let's get back to ChatGPT. Using ChatGPT for learning and teaching Chinese is a very broad topic, as this is a very versatile tool that can be used for many things. So in this episode, I'm focusing on the question if ChatGPT can pass the HSK. I will write more about using ChatGPT to learn Chinese in a later article, so if you have any questions, opinions, or experiences related to this, please get in touch. So first things first, what is ChatGPT? Well, it is a chatbot, so it's basically a web interface where you can type questions and input text, and the bot will then respond to what you write and interact with you. If you haven't tried it out yourself yet, I strongly recommend that you do. I didn't really believe the hype to start with, but after having played around with it now for a few months and really trying it for a large variety of tasks, I can tell you that it's much better than I thought it was, and most of the hype is actually real. And if you didn't believe what I said about it passing take-home exams in university courses, that is definitely a real thing. Of course, this depends on how the exams are graded and how the questions are presented and so on, but if you take an average take-home exam where you're supposed to summarize the course literature and maybe do some basic analysis and write something simple, ChatGPT can definitely do that. In my university job, I have talked to many colleagues who have taken their actual take-home exams in various subjects, not just languages, and tested how well ChatGPT does on these exams. And it's not unusual that ChatGPT produces answers that would have passed the exam if a student handed them in. Naturally, this podcast is about learning Chinese, but if you're interested in these other things, I suggest you go to YouTube and search for your field of expertise, and then ChatGPT and see what other people have produced. I have introduced ChatGPT to a number of colleagues and other people, and what strikes me is that most people don't really believe how good this tool is unless you've seen it yourself or if you've tried it yourself. So don't just take everybody's word for it, go and check it out yourself. I can't make you do this. I can talk about what it's able to do with HSK, as I will in this episode, but there's only really one way of really understanding how it works and what it can and cannot do, and that is to try it yourself. So go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to share with you in this episode is my attempt at letting ChatGPT take the HSK and see how it performed. I warmed up by asking it about itself, about what it knew about the HSK, and also if it thought it would be able to pass the HSK. Here is our conversation. What is ChatGPT? ChatGPT is a conversational language model developed by OpenAI. It's based on the GPT-3 architecture, which is a state-of-the-art language model that has been trained on a massive corpus of text data from the internet. The goal of ChatGPT is to generate human-like text responses given a prompt, allowing it to participate in conversations and answer questions on a variety of topics. The model has been fine-tuned for various conversational tasks, including response generation, question answering, and dialogue generation. Say that in one sentence in plain language. ChatGPT is a computer program created by OpenAI that can have written conversations with people, generating texts based on the information it learned from the internet. Tell me about the HSK. The HSK is a standardized test that assesses the Chinese language proficiency of non-native speakers. It was created by the Chinese government and is used for various purposes, including for admission to Chinese universities, for visa and immigration purposes, and for job applications. The HSK covers a wide range of language skills, including vocabulary, grammar, reading comprehension, and listening comprehension. The test is divided into 6 levels, with level 1 being the most basic and level 6 being the most advanced. Each level becomes increasingly difficult, testing more advanced grammar structures, vocabulary, and comprehension abilities. I see. So do you think you could pass the HSK? As an AI language model, I don't have personal opinions or emotions, but I can certainly respond to questions and perform various language-related tasks. In terms of passing the HSK, I have been trained on a large amount of Chinese language text and should be able to demonstrate a high level of proficiency in the language. However, since the HSK test assesses both linguistic and practical abilities, it's possible that my responses might not reflect the full range of abilities that the test evaluates. It's also worth noting that while I have been trained on a large corpus of text, this training data may not fully reflect the real-life language use tested by the HSK, so I may not perform optimally on the test. Nevertheless, I am capable of generating Chinese text, answering questions in Chinese, and carrying out other language-related tasks that might be relevant to the HSK. Okay, let's try and see how well you do. Certainly, I'll do my best to answer any questions you have in Chinese. Please keep in mind that my knowledge is limited to what I have been trained on and my responses might not always be perfect. However, I will do my best to help with any questions or tasks you have in mind. Okay, enough of that, and let's get back to some practical questions. I mean, can ChatGPT even take the HSK? Well, obviously it cannot. It cannot register, you have to be a real person to do that, and so on. You also need to understand instructions, how the test is structured, how to answer questions, and so on. But that's clearly not what we are interested in here. We want to know how well it does with the Chinese language bits, obviously. Well, there are some problems here that we need to discuss before we even start. So for example, for HSK 1 and 2, there are lots of images, and ChatGPT only has a text interface, at least at the moment. So there's no easy way to feed these images to ChatGPT, and therefore it cannot answer these questions. So for the discussion here, I have ignored HSK 1 and 2 and started at HSK 3, where the images are more decorative or at least not necessary to answer the questions. I'm also going with HSK 2.0 because we don't have anything for the new HSK 3.0 and most students are of course still taking the HSK 2.0, especially of course if we're talking about HSK 1 through 6. For the new HSK 3.0, we only have the most advanced levels 7 through 9 rolling out this spring. We also need to look at different parts of the test and see which might be possible to actually complete. So the standard test, or the test that most people take, doesn't include speaking because that's much more expensive to administer and most people simply don't do that. And that means that we are normally limited to listening, reading, and writing. Now, listening here is not terribly interesting because it's actually the same as reading, provided that the speech-to-text software works as it should. And ChatGPT doesn't even have voice input at the moment. And if it did, it would mostly still be about whether or not the transcription function works as it should or not. If it does, it's essentially the same as reading comprehension, because it's definitely going to do its magic on the written text, not your original spoken audio anyway. So that means that I'm leaving out listening here, not because it's not interesting, but it seems to be a different kind of problem. And I'm actually also going to exclude writing here, because I'm not a certified HSK examiner. I do not know the guidelines or how you assess the written answers and so on. So it's very difficult for me to say if a written answer would have passed the HSK or not. I simply don't know. For the listening and reading parts, though, we have multiple choice questions, so we can easily verify how many points ChatGPT will get. So this means that we are mainly talking about reading comprehension here, and I include all parts of the reading, and it depends a little bit on what level of HSK you're looking at. Sometimes it's fill in the blanks, sometimes it's identify the incorrect sentence, sometimes it's just straight up reading comprehension questions. And we'll see how ChatGPT does on these different types of questions. To check how well ChatGPT does, I am using the officially published mock exams for HSK 3 to 6. And if you want to check them yourself, you can check the links in the article on Hacking Chinese. And this might be useful if you want to see which questions ChatGPT got wrong, what kind of questions those were, and so on. And in the article, I publish lots of information, including tables over what the right answer is, what ChatGPT thought the real answer was, and so on. And so if you want more than I'm able to present in this podcast episode, just head over to Hacking Chinese. In the article, I don't go through every single question, of course, because that would take a very long time if I did it for HSK 3, 4, 5, and 6. I will do my best to not make this podcast episode too long, which means that I will talk about the results and I will share my thoughts about those results, but I will not present the questions themselves. This would essentially just be reading the questions on the mock exam, and these are freely available and you can just download and check them. And for HSK3, I also included them so you can see the interaction between me and ChatGPT in the article on Hacking Chinese. So to begin with, ChatGPT is rather good at understanding what the question actually is. So if you just post a question with a somewhat clear instruction, it will give you some type of answer that follows those instructions most of the time. What's funny though is that the first reading question on HSK3 doesn't even have any instructions. It's just a set of 6 responses and then 6 utterances, and you're supposed to match them. It doesn't anywhere say that you have to do this, but they do show you with one example. ChatGPT dealt with this fairly well when I added an instruction for what it was supposed to do. And you also have to specify things like it can only use one option once, and this is not specified on the exam either, but this is actually the case. So for the first 5 questions, it's just meant to match 5 responses with 5 utterances. The example they give is 你知道怎么去那儿吗? And the response you're supposed to match this with is 当然，我们先坐公共汽车，然后换地铁. So ChatGPT got all of these right. For the next set of 5 responses and 5 utterances, it did something unexpected. It didn't really follow the instructions because it answered E twice, and it didn't use the alternative B at all. So what I do in these cases is just to tell it you can only use each option once, and usually it spits out an answer that is in line with instructions, as if it needed reminding or something. I don't actually know why it does that. In any case, this didn't go as well. It got 3 incorrect and only 2 correct answers. I want to note here that the answers it gave before I forced it to use each option exactly once would actually have netted it 4 points, 4 out of 5 instead of 2 out of 5 like it did now. And this is something I realized after testing a lot with different levels of HSK questions, that if I don't force it to give answers according to the instructions, it will lose a lot of points in general, because it might just misunderstand what the question is or do something completely different. So I decided early on to only allow answers that fully match the expected answers, so you're not allowed to use option E twice when you know it can only be used once. So no parley bets allowed, in other words. Okay, but so far so good. 7 out of 10 is not bad. It's clearly better than pure guessing, of course. Moving on to HSK 3 Part 2, we now have fill in the blanks. So these are 2 sets of 5 sentences with a gap in each sentence, and you then have a list of words that are supposed to fit in these blanks. And you can only use each word once again. So again, I just prompted the bot to use each word and fill in the blanks. And of course, the goal here is to produce natural sounding or appropriate sentences in Chinese, and that kind of goes without saying. Here, ChatGPT did very well, so 10 out of 10. And this is not very confusing if you think of it. It has a huge amount of training data for normal sounding Chinese texts, and it just needs to see which words are more statistically likely to appear together, and that's probably normal Chinese, and these sentences are not very strange and they are not meant to trick you or anything. It's just meant to see, can you fit these words into sentences? Do you know the grammar? Do you know the vocabulary to figure out what things mean? And if you can do that, you'll pass. So while it's cool that it got 10 out of 10, this is not very surprising in my opinion. In part 3, you have reading comprehension questions. So this would be when you have a very short text. This is still HSK 3, so it's pretty basic. And then you have a reading comprehension question, and you're supposed to pick the right answer based on the text you've read. And you've all seen tons of these questions, and there's nothing fancy about them. For a human, that is. Because some of these questions seem to require you to understand what's going on and make some simple deductions based on that, but as it turns out, ChatGPT has no problem at all and nails all 10 questions. Okay, so at this point, I think some of you might have thought of something that we should think about and we really should discuss. Isn't ChatGPT just copying the answers from somewhere? I mean, this mock exam has been available online for many, many years, and it's used training data from the internet, so, doesn't it just know the answer based on that? I think the answer here is a clear no. There are several reasons for this. The first one is that the answers are not written out here in the exam itself. Rather, they are just presented as a table at the end of the exam, but this is not the same as being part of a text corpus where the correct answers are just listed or something like that. But okay, there are probably many analyses of this mock exam available online where other people have printed or written these answers in plain text, so that could be part of the training data, right? Well, yeah, that could be the case, but then again, why does it get some answers incorrect in that case? Wouldn't it just be able to get everything right immediately? But the biggest reason I think that ChatGPT doesn't just copy the answers is that I've tried changing details in these texts so that the answers also become different, and it's still able to answer the questions correctly. I have also taken my own and my colleagues' Chinese exams that definitely aren't available online to see how ChatGPT does with these. And it does pretty well still. Well, as we shall see, it doesn't do very well on advanced exams, but when it comes to these types of basic questions, such as the ones we've looked at here, it does as well on the exams that I've either tinkered with or written myself, so I'm pretty sure it's not copying from anywhere. Okay, that being cleared out of the way, if you have kept track of the score, you should know that ChatGPT got 27 out of 30 questions right on HSK 3, which is pretty good. Definitely enough to pass that bit at least. So moving on to HSK 4 and 5, this is not terribly interesting because it was just me copying text from the mock exam, reformatting it slightly so it fits in ChatGPT. So for example, it doesn't like long sentences without spaces, it kind of freezes up. So you have to manipulate the text a little bit. Sometimes I clarified what the question actually is and things like that. Like I said earlier, I'm not interested in if it can understand the instructions, I'm interested in if it can perform the tasks that are being asked of the exam taker. So some prompts here were rather tricky actually. For example, there are numerous places where there are multiple blanks in the same text. So you have a text that might have, say, 4 gaps, and then you have 3 sets of 4 words, and you're supposed to choose which of these sets match all the 4 gaps. And like you probably realize, this is not easy to explain even in English in this podcast here, and it's very difficult to make this question make sense for ChatGPT. And there is a way around this, I think. I could, for example, have posted the same text 4 times with each of the alternatives inserted into the text, and then ask ChatGPT to choose which of these 4 texts was the correct one. But to do that with every single question would have taken a lot more time than this already took, so I didn't do that. Still, once I got it to actually answer in a way that I wanted it to, and I don't mean which letters or which options it chose, I just mean that it outputted something that could be the right answer, and not just, say, translating the text or doing something else, it actually got all but 2 right. So if we look at the results, it did quite well on HSK 4. It had 35 out of 40 questions correctly answered. Again, it completely demolished the single blanks. Like we said earlier, this shouldn't be very surprising, but it had 0 errors in this section. Then in part 2, it's supposed to put sentences in the most logical order, and this was trickier, but it still managed to get 7 out of 10 correct. Finally, there are some reading comprehension questions in part 3, and these are still not very complicated, and the test doesn't really try to trick you or anything, so ChatGPT only got 2 incorrect answers out of 20. That leaves us with 35 points in total, or 88%. So moving on to the results from HSK 5, it did pretty well on the multiple blanks, as I said. It got 2 wrong out of 15, so 13 correct answers, and not bad. Then it nailed the matching statements. You're supposed to match statements a little bit like in HSK 3. It got everything right there. And then for the reading comprehension questions, it did fairly well too. It just missed 5 out of 20. So this brings us up to 38 out of 45, or 84% of the total. Okay, so ChatGPT has slaughtered its way through the low-level enemies and it's now facing the big boss, HSK 6. After you've interacted with ChatGPT a bit, it feels a bit strange sometimes. You start thinking, well, I know intellectually that ChatGPT doesn't think, but sometimes it really feels like it does. And this becomes fairly relevant in HSK 6 because there are many questions where the answers aren't written out in plain text. They are not explicitly mentioned. You're supposed to infer them, and ChatGPT doesn't do very well here. If you're interested in the philosophical argument whether or not something that behaves and interacts on a human-like manner can be proved to actually be thinking, I suggest you check out the Chinese Room article on Wikipedia, or you can also read the science fiction novel Blindside by Peter Watts. Anyway, these limitations become fairly apparent on HSK 6 because these questions, like I said, are not as straightforward. It's not anymore about just extracting information from the text and matching that to the most appropriate answer. So in the first part of HSK, you're supposed to pick one of 4 sentences that is a 病句, or in other words, a sentence that is ungrammatical or has some language issue. Here, ChatGPT got about 50% of the answers right, which is still much better than guessing, but a lot worse than we saw in HSK 4 and 5. Part 2 and 3 of the boss fight are a little bit easier because we have these multiple blanks again, and as we have seen before, ChatGPT does very well on these, so it missed only 2 in each section, so that's 2 out of 10 or 4 out of 20. And so finally, cue epic boss battle music, we get to the reading comprehension questions. And this is where I expected ChatGPT to do the worst, because these questions are deliberately meant to trick you. It presents information that means if you're reading very quickly or with shallow understanding, you will get the questions wrong. Like I said earlier, it's also often the case that the answer isn't written explicitly in the article, or different words are being used, or it's strongly implied that something is the right answer, but it isn't written out. For some of these, ChatGPT just refused to give an answer. It just said that you cannot answer this question based on information in the text. And in these cases, I just forced it to do that anyway, so I asked it to choose the one it thought was the most likely to be the right answer. So how badly did it do then? Well, it got 10 questions wrong out of 20, so 50%, or the same as in part 1 with the Bingju. If we add all this up, we can see that it got 30 points out of 50, or 60%. Okay, so now that we have checked HSK 3 to 6, can we say that ChatGPT is able to pass the HSK? Well, HSK is an exam you either pass or fail based on all the parts, and we don't know about the listening and the writing parts, so it's hard to say, right? But if we extrapolate the results from the reading part and just assume that it would do as well on the others, it would certainly pass the lower levels, i.e. HSK 3 to 5, without a problem. It would even pass some of them even if it got 0 points on the writing part, for example, because it got so many points on the reading part. HSK 6 with 60% correct answers is of course not as good, but it's still a lot better than I thought it would do. This is quite amazing after all. There were many questions that I feel that you really need to be able to understand what's going on and make some kind of inference based on what you're reading and then give the right answer, and it still got it right, at least most of the time. But what does all this mean? Well, we now have a chatbot that is able to pass university exams in a variety of subjects, and I think we can include Chinese in that list. Naturally, it would be possible to construct exams it wouldn't be able to pass, because you can just have a certain type of question it struggles with, but in general, if you have a standard exam with, say, fill in the blanks or reading comprehension questions that aren't too difficult, ChatGPT will be able to pass such an exam. This is of course also just the beginning. I think we can expect these tools to get much better in the near future, maybe so good that they can also pass the type of questions that ChatGPT struggled with in this round. However, while I think this discussion is very interesting, I mean the question of whether or not ChatGPT can pass a certain exam, what really matters for us learners and teachers is how we can use ChatGPT to learn and teach better. I mean, hacking Chinese is about learning and teaching Chinese. It's not about cheating on an exam. That falls completely outside the scope of this podcast and the website. If you are using ChatGPT to hand in your homework or something, well, maybe you pass, maybe you won't. But you are certainly not learning any Chinese if you just let the bot do the homework for you. This is exactly the same as asking somebody else who's better at Chinese than you are to write your homework for you. It's just that this is more accessible and easier to do. So how can we use ChatGPT to learn and teach Chinese then? Well, I have lots of ideas. I've been playing around with ChatGPT for a couple of months now, but I don't want to really rush out an article and say how you can use it to improve your reading and writing abilities or something like that. Instead, I want to think about these things for a bit, and I want to hear what you think about them too. So like I said in the introduction, if you have used ChatGPT or if you've seen anybody else use ChatGPT for something interesting when it comes to learning or teaching languages, do let me know. And what I'm most interested in knowing is, of course, what did you try and what worked well, and naturally also what didn't work so well, because as we've seen, there are lots of limitations as well. So once I've collected my ideas, maybe I get some good ideas from you, I will collect these into an article and I will publish it on Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.